Hi, Liz. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing great. Welcome to Tomorrow Talks. This is a forum where people from Tomorrow Lab, which is a design studio in New York, it's where people from Tomorrow Lab ask questions from smart people and figure out what tomorrow looks like. And
Well, I'm
so,
excited. I'd love to know what tomorrow looks like as well.
great. Hopefully, through a conversation, we can figure some things out.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll take care of that.
Awesome. One of the reasons why I was super excited to talk to you is if I were to think of what you are a sage at, it is sort of like, what do people do with their lives in a
Hmm.
society in which most of us think about our lives as what we work on? Your book, The Rocket Years, I think really sets up, yes, sweet plug. Your book, The Rocket Years, really sets up a fascinating thesis around what key period of your life sort of sets you on your trajectory, but also I think worth thinking about the decisions that we made in that period of our lives
Hmm.
that kind of can inform us now that we're in our 30s.
And I actually feel so lucky to be having this conversation with you because you and I actually went to college together. We didn't spend that much time together, unfortunately, in college, but I have a distinct memory of you in those years, and just being here with you kind of takes me back to that decade and what I was thinking about at the time, and how the decisions that both of us made, we all made in those years, sometimes consciously and sometimes subconsciously, have led to the life that we have now. I mean, who would have guessed, in the dorms, at 11 o'clock at night getting a snack, that we were basically setting the seeds or sowing the seeds for the life that we have now as parents, and as people who are interested in design and people who are thinking about these topics.
So, in a world where sort of we've reconsidered our institutions, in some cases very purposely torn them down, or in other cases exposed them thanks to journalism for their predatory behaviors, or in some cases just watched them kind of fail due to avarice. I'm not going to name the university, but just some universities have become real estate companies, right? Um, and in response to that, we become flexible, you know, people. What is leadership supposed to look like now in an age where we're not post institution, but we are like in an age where like institutions generate an enormous amount of skepticism?
In some ways, we've become a lot more democratic, right? We just kind of reject this idea of hierarchies, right? I mean, that was an essential part of what the institutions that we've rejected stood for. And so now we believe in a much more kind of open sourced, sort of like flat, um, sort of a structure, right, in all of the institutions that we've created and cultivated. But I think the downside of that, I mean, there's so many benefits to that, right? That we're so much more open to ideas. We're not ageist, in a lot of the institutions that we belong to now, or a lot of the workplaces we belong to, like Fast Company, and I'm sure at your company, we are open to ideas from anywhere, and we're constantly looking for talent wherever it's found. And so there are so many amazing things about this. But the problem is that now, there isn't sort of one person who defines the idea, or is willing to stand up and sort of be the point, and spreads our message, right? And I think that the problem is that now we're fighting against institutions where there is a spokesperson, where there is somebody who's willing to sort of be this like caricatured version of like that idea, whether that's in politics or, in companies or universities. And so the problem is, I think this is an inherent problem. I don't have an answer to it, but the problem with the way that we have structured our lives and our worlds is that we don't have, these sort of like very stereotypical versions of leaders who can speak up against the institutions that are kind of oppressing us. And I think that that's a real problem. That's just a microcosm of what we're seeing in all these other fields as well, in politics, in corporations. It's a real problem. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I tend to agree with you. It's sort of like when you leave a hierarchy, like a hierarchy can kind of have some benefits to it, right? So like if there is a strong morality or ethical structure within that hierarchy, even if the whole idea of the hierarchy is somewhat unethical, at least it filters down really well, and it can keep not so much in order, but like
A coherence?
what's that?
A coherence?
A coherence, and it can also like push down like goodness, right? Like good ideas. And when those things are gone, you sort of have to rely on what feels a little bit more of a laissez-faire, almost like libertarian approach to, like distributing the idea of ethics, right? And so, right now, like, how does a person create their moral compass? How do they create a library of ethics that they refer to when there aren't really an established set of institutions? You have your family, who you may accept or reject, and you sort of like use your brain to decide what you want. And then you have just sort of like a tremendous amount of social chaos that you tap into. This can have benefits, I think, because we can see what our friends feel and think. And I certainly right now have like an Instagram feed that like kind of keeps me true and like helps me like remember exactly the pain that oppressed people feel in this country, right? Like every day is another reminder of what it's like to be Black in America, a concept I cannot fathom, but something I can be at least reminded of. But if my social feed was different, I can be reminded of very different things. And without sort of an institutional or sort of like point of leadership, what's to say which sort of chaotic swirl I end up in?
There's two dangers there that I see. One is that, we were basically fighting against these institutions, right? And so in a lot of ways, we created our identities in reaction to the ones that already existed. I
Mhm.
think the faith example is a good one, right? Like all of the emerging, ways of doing religion were a direct response to the institutions that came before us. And so we're kind of among the first generation to be sort of really sort of like deconstructing all of the institutions that historically people use to define their moral compass. I'm really concerned about what comes after this, because for us, at least we sort of defined ourselves, in reaction to something. I think that my daughter, who's 4 now, doesn't have anything to even fight against, right? It's just so diffuse, and it's exactly what you're talking about. And I think that there are two possible dangers with that. One is that I think it's relatively easy to radicalize somebody who doesn't have anything to hold on to. It's easy to sort of impose an ideology on someone who doesn't have anything to cling to, and is sort of like getting thrown about by waves, right? And I don't, I'm not worried about her becoming like radicalized in sort of like a traditional and a like overly simplistic way, but I am worried about some very structured ideology kind of appealing to her because she doesn't have anything to cling on to. And secondly, I think the other danger with this is exactly what you're talking about, which is that even if you are label yourself progressive, right? It's becoming increasingly hard to know what that means because there's so many conflicting versions of that available around us. And so I don't necessarily think that any of this is inherently problematic. I think that we need to create a framework for basically giving people the tools to construct their own identity in this kind of new world that we live in, right? A world where the institutions are not telling us, what we need to believe, and even a world where we're not like rejecting those institutions. We're one step past that, where there's really a lot of different worldviews to pick from, and you sort of like make your own like fruit salad based on that, right?
Yeah.
And I really think that what we need sort of a way to sort of give our children the sense that, and I would say that, the rocket years, the 20s are a great period to do that, but basically say, look, this is the world that we live in now. You can pick your identity from so many different sources, right? And so you really need to spend some time thinking, consciously about the kind of world you're looking to create, the kind of person you're trying to be, because, nobody's really going to help you out with that, right? We've created a world where people can control their life. That was what we were all fighting for with all of the different movements, the feminist movement, the labor movements. All of that was to give us the choice that we have now. And I think that is hugely empowering and so exhilarating and exciting, but it's also paralyzing. It is an incredibly paralyzing feeling to have all of that choice and not know what to do with it, and not have any structures helping us figure out how we design our own lives. And so fundamentally, what I was trying to do with my book, and I think that what we're talking about right now, is giving people a framework that will allow them to construct and design their own life. And I think that's really what has been missing. And I think that's the missing piece to the entire conversation we've had today.
Yeah, and I like the idea of it being a framework and not really a guide. And I'm also very interested in it being something that is, um, impossibly iterative, right? That just like allows you to go back to the framework whenever you want to take stock of what you know, what you have, what your resources are. And I'm interested in like, to bring this to a social justice point, what can that framework do to help people who are like, we're speaking about this as like you and I have all of this freedom, but there are still millions of people in America, tens of millions of people in America who don't have that freedom, right? And is this a framework that can kind of like help people who have less wiggle room, less like, choice? If you're in a world where you absolutely just cannot get the education that you need, you can't design your own life. If you're in a world where like you're just absolutely terrified that the institutions that keep everyone else theoretically safe are going to murder you, you can't design your own life. And I kind of like wonder if like a framework also tells us what paths we need to clear.
Our job is to be very grateful for the choices that we have, and also look around us to institutions that need to fall, and to help tear down the existing sort of oppressive structures that are around us, right? And it is incumbent on us as people who are able to enjoy this freedom to design our own life, to make sure that other people have that freedom as well. I think that that's inherently part of it. But I really do think that what still needs to happen here is, people like you, people who are designers, and people who are just sort of thinking about this, and parents, right? You and I are both parents. We need to come up with a better way of helping generations to come deal with all of this freedom, and basically give them something to work with so that they don't squander it, right? I think it's so possible. I mean,
Squander or be hurt by it, right?
Totally. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we, even for us, right, there was this notion in our 20s that we needed to go out and like make all our mistakes, and just like use all of that period of, the lack of responsibility to go out and just like be crazy. I think that's a very American concept that, is like passed on. And I don't think that that's quite right. I mean, I do think that we should have the freedom to make mistakes, and we should, enjoy the freedom to choose and design our life as we're talking about. But we're not really giving young people structures and frameworks to sort of help them figure out, how to make sense of all of the choice in front of them. And that's the thing that is still lacking.
It's critical too, because if you create, like, so a big piece of what we've tried to do in terms of like creating a just society is, I think it's often referred to as like level the playing field, right? And so you and I have entered a world with the most level playing field that's probably existed in a long time, maybe ever, and we didn't know what to do with it. And we have a lot of lessons to teach about that. But if we continue to level this playing field and people don't have a framework to work within, it's going to hurt them. And people are going to turn around and say, like, level playing fields suck. Can we just go back to the thing where, there was a person who told me what to do? And
Totally.
I think if we want to build the freest possible society, like, you have to prepare people for freedom. And like, we're inherently not really free when we're with our parents. And that transition, this is what I'm getting, right? That transition from being under the roof of your parents to being under your own speed. If you learn how to work with that freedom to design the life you want, yeah, I think you can make a much better society.
And I think that it comes down, and so what does that framework really look like? I mean, I've tried to think about that a little bit in my book, but it was just scratching the surface. But I think it really has to do with giving people time in that decade, as they're transitioning away from, their family home into their own adult life, giving them time to really think about what matters. And I think that, that means, personally, like, what matters to them, what are they passionate about, what are they good at, what do they enjoy doing, but thinking more broadly about, what matters for society, what is really worth, spending all of this freedom, this free time, these choices on, right? And I think that just giving people the time and the space and the tools to wrestle with that will be so powerful in terms of, letting the next generation go off and not squander all of the gains that, that have been bestowed upon them.
Yeah, it's I am curious about what the framework ends up looking like. And you don't want it to be too prescriptive, otherwise you're starting to suggest, like, well, what is the value of freedom, right?
Right.
um, and at the same time, it needs enough inputs too, right? So like,
But I think that just having this conversation today, I think that the better, more productive thing to do is to think about, we have given them a lot of choice, and we're continuing to fight so that they have more choice and more sovereignty over their own future, than even we had. And we're also, giving them a world where, the remaining power structures are becoming more and more evident. So what can we do, to sort of empower them to use the freedoms that they have to continue fighting, to continue the fight? I mean, I think that that's a much more empowering way of approaching it than what I generally do, which is like, I think, okay, I look at the New York Times and I'm like, you know what, I think I'm just going to go back to sleep now and pretend like the world isn't isn't falling apart around me, right? Like, I think this is actually a much more productive way to use this energy that we have right now.
this was amazing. I'm so happy and really proud that I got to talk to you and that you even remembered who I was. So I'm like, yes. And I'm really excited about your book and your career, and all the writing you're doing. To anyone watching, you can read many things by Liz. She has another book besides The Rocket Years called The River Speaks. And she writes frequently for Fast Company Design. So you can see her articles daily there.
Thank you. This was amazing. And I just feel so lucky that we were able to have this conversation after so many years. I feel like, this was the perfect conversation to have with somebody that I knew when we were 18.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much.
Thank you.